Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. So to mark World Refugee Day, which is officially on Sunday, we are delighted to be hosting this bonus Open Courtauld event. So in the next hour, we are going to explore the work of refugee artists and also the collection of Ben Uri Gallery. So this gallery's collection surpasses ethnic, cultural and religious obstacles to engagement within the arts sector. It addresses contemporary and historical issues of identity and migration and celebrates, researches and records the rich Jewish and immigrant experience in the visual arts since 1900. And for these critical conversations, I'm delighted to say that Sarah MacDougall, Director of Ben Uri Gallery, and Aviva Burnstock, who's Professor of Conservation here at the Courtauld, are going to take us through key works of refugee artists and also contextualise the artists and their work in 2021, as well as giving us a few insights into their latest projects. This session will end with a Q&A, where I will be able to ask any of your questions to Sarah and Aviva. And to get those questions to me, please just pop them in the chat throughout the conversation. Now that we've got through this little bit of housekeeping, I wanted to say thank you again to Sarah and Aviva and pass it over to them to get started. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Layla. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you, Sarah, for including me in this. I'm very pleased to be asked. Sarah asked me to first explain, before she begins, how we met. And in fact, we met when she came with Robert Travers from Piano Noble Gallery. She brought in a painting, which I think she's going to upload in a minute. It was by a small panel by Mark Gertler. Yeah, so she and Robert brought in this painting, a small sketch of 1916, The Pond at Garsington by Gertler. And we x-rayed the painting and we discovered that it was the only known coloured sketch for the merry-go-round, which is his masterwork, which is in the Tate at the moment. 1916 is a very well-known painting, and the merry-go-round. And so it was a really exciting discovery, and she and I got to know each other through that moment where I was doing the technical analysis, the X-radiography. And then we discovered, so that you can see the X-ray in black and white at the lower edge, so it was rotated. So this pond at Garsington was rotated. You could see that he'd reused this. He'd painted over the sketch for the merry-go-round with this pond at Garsington, and underneath was this amazing coloured sketch that we later discovered for the merry-go-round, which you can see at Tate. And we then started a project together because Sarah's the world expert in Gertler's life and works and knows every single painting and every person who owns the painting, and is a fantastic person to work with. So we got on very well, and we did a project on Mark Gertler's paintings from 1911 to 18, which was a period in which he developed his painting style and technique, and it was a fascinating study, and we finished that, and now we continue to work together because we get on very well and we have complementary expertise. So I'm a person who does technical analysis of paintings, and she's an expert curator and historian, so that combination is really a great one to work with. And also the other reason was that I have a sort of personal interest in Gertler because he was more or less contemporary with my father, or a little bit older than my father, who was a secular Jew who'd come to London and was the grandson of emigres who came as from Europe in the early part of the 20th century. So I hoped in the course of investigating Gertler, I could find out more about my father's life, which was a kind of personal angle to it. So I hope now that Sarah, after that, will take us through some slides that she's chosen from the Ben Uri collection, which has relevance to the theme of artistic impact of refugees on the landscape of the UK. And I will ask her questions as she goes along.
Thank you to Aviva for that lovely introduction, and also to Layla for inviting us to take part in today's event, marking Refugee Week 2021. And I thought I would just start with this image by Mark Gertler from the Ben Uri collection to pick up on what Aviva has been saying before we move into works which express more exactly the refugee theme of today's presentation. Gertler, of course, was not a refugee as such, but from a family of economic migrants. And whether or not a distinction is drawn between these things is something that I think we're going to perhaps touch on later. But the work that you see on screen represents both a classic image of the Jewish diaspora and also specifically of Jewish settlement in London's East End, which Aviva touched on. And that's the history which is also very much part of the Ben Uri collection.
So, Sarah, can you first tell us a bit about Ben Uri and when the Ben Uri collection was founded?
Sure. So the Ben Uri itself was founded in 1915 in London's East End, which was then the heart of London's Jewish quarter. And this was in the midst of the First World War. And it was founded by a Russian Jewish immigrant artist called Lazar Burson as a platform for Jewish artists who could not access the usual cultural bastions in the West End, and to bring together artists and craftsmen from his same background who were working outside the traditional mainstream. So the name itself was chosen after Bezalel Ben Uri, who is the biblical artist of the Ark of the Covenant. And it was also to suggest a kinship with the Bezalel School of Art in Jerusalem, which had been founded some 9 years earlier. The collection itself began in 1919 with works by the then disgraced Pre-Raphaelite artist Simeon Solomon, and it was followed by David Bomberg's Ghetto Theatre in 1920, and a work that's perhaps less familiar to the audience today, Samuel Hershenberg's 1923 Sabbath Rest, which was sort of narrative painting of a Jewish family. So it reflected a kind of broadly eclectic taste in line with the tastes of the then founders. Today, 100 years on, it really reflects 3 waves of migration to the UK. Firstly, that of the Eastern European Jewish founders who came around 1880, 1910, and their children, such as Mark Gertler on the screen, and other Whitechapel boys, including David Bomberg. Secondly, and currently probably the biggest section of the collection, is the so-called Hitler emigre generation. They came between 1933 to 45, fleeing Nazi religious, cultural, political and ethnic persecution. And that cohort includes both well-known artists such as Naum Gabo, Ludwig Meidner, Kurt Schwitters, but also many lesser-known figures. And they all had a significant influence on the collection and exhibiting policy of Ben Uri. And then finally, the third wave reflects post-war migration to Britain. Of course, that's a huge subject and one can almost hardly put it all together, but at present it's the smallest section of the collection, although eventually, of course, it will be the largest. So everything we do really reflects this Jewish and immigrant contribution to the British visual arts since 1900. And of course, since 2002, our remit has really widened to include relevant artists from all ethnicities and nationalities who have a relevance to the collection. So I'll touch on, I guess, all 3 of those waves throughout the presentation as we look at different images.
You've mentioned migration, but what can you tell us about refugees in the Ben Uri collection?
Yes, well, there are certain artists and artworks that can definitely be described as either by or about refugees. So the title image for today's event, which Leila used on the publicity for the event by Joseph Hermann, is explicitly entitled Refugees, and I'll return to that shortly. But I wanted to begin with another image. This is one by an artist called Victor Hargerman, and it's called The Emigrants. And this also illustrates the crossover and the sort of blurring between these many labels of refugees, exiles, immigrants, migrants, and so forth. And this blurring is often both by the artists themselves and the stories that they tell. Not everyone likes to fit into a neat label, and nor do they. However, the artist of this picture, Victor Hargerman, was not a refugee or an immigrant himself. He was born and raised in Antwerp in Belgium, and he was a socially conscious realist painter who specialized in studies of migrants, particularly his Russian Jewish neighbors, who were principally the inhabitants of the Antwerp Jewish quarter. And these are the people who we see on the screen in this painting. This work is actually on a monumental scale, so it has a sort of really emotive impact when you stand face to face with those sad, traumatic expressions, which really capture the trauma of what we usually refer to at Ben Uri as forced journeys, a kind of catch-all for these different journeys that they're all making. We know that the people are specifically a Jewish family because he exhibited the work under that title, and on the reverse is an inscription which reads "Descendant Israelite." And the painting, interestingly, originally belonged to the Speth family in Antwerp, and they were owners of the Red Star Line, which arranged for many Jewish emigrants to travel to America.
Do you think there's a distinction between refugees, those who have to leave on peril of their lives, and economic migrants who just come because they want a better life?
Yes, we sort of touched on that just at the beginning there with Gertler, who would come under the economic migrant category. But obviously, those leaving at a moment's notice, such as the refugees in this work by Joseph Hermann, we know very specifically they're refugees. This picture suggests that they've gathered everything and left at a moment's notice. On the other hand, economic migrants like the Gertlers, who actually tried many times to come to the UK before they eventually settled here. So Gertler was born here, but that was really just an accident because his family were then repatriated with him to their native Galicia, then in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a year later, where they were really at the bottom of the heap, almost starved, experienced persecution, experienced impoverished conditions. So although a distinction is often drawn, again, I think it's one of these things where there is very much a blurring between these experiences. Joseph Hermann, the artist of this painting, refused and refuted the label refugee for himself, although we might think to apply that to him. He was a Polish Jewish artist born in working class Warsaw, and he had to leave his native Warsaw in 1938 owing to rising anti-Semitism. He was always ending up in prison, losing teeth, and decided to leave. And he went to Brussels for artistic reasons. He was interested in the Flemish Expressionists. But with the advent of the Second World War, he had then to flee Brussels. He went to France, had to flee France, and he ended up actually in Scotland, initially in Glasgow, wartime Glasgow, where he was part of a surprising resurgence of art with a fellow Polish Jewish immigrant, Jankel Adler, and where this work was painted.
Do you think this painting was influenced by Goya's black paintings?
That's a really interesting question. I think it was influenced by a number of artistic inspirations for Hermann. The reference to Goya's black pictures, I think you refer to the small child down there with her fist literally stuck into her mouth to stop her crying out. Again, a hugely emotive image, and that reminds us very much of those figures in the Goya Black paintings, where they're being sort of fed into the imagery there. But other influences are also apparent, such as that of Käthe Kollwitz, and also very distinctly that of Chagall. The influence of Chagall was one that troubled Hermann, and which he refuted, and he actually destroyed many paintings from this period because of what he saw as that influence. This one was thought to be lost for about 60 years, and was a fantastic moment when it turned up. But the story that it tells as well is also one, I think, that is specifically around that refugee experience.
Do you think the image represents a difference in the experience of refugees specifically compared with that of economic migrants in earlier periods?
Yes, I do. I think the family have clearly just kind of picked everything up and left at a moment's notice. You can see the father is clutching a bundle of bedding under his arm, and just the gestures of the people. He has this very protective arm encircling his wife, and she herself encircles and holds very tightly the two children. We know that the painting draws strongly on Hermann's Eastern European Jewish heritage and themes. In his diary and memoirs, he wrote about these moonlit spires of his native Warsaw, and we find these things being used as tropes in the work of this period, that moon in particular and that shade of blue. But also the cat in the picture with the mouse dripping with blood from its jaw. That symbolises the fate, of course, the unknown fate of these refugees, but we sense it is not necessarily a happy one.
The collection at Ben Uri includes works by non-Jewish artists who also had experience of exile. Do you have any examples of that?
Yes,
those works?
I thought a good example might be this work by George Gross, who was a non-Jewish German artist, an outspoken critic, of course, of militarism, hypocrisy, corruption, and therefore a natural enemy of the Nazi regime. So he was forced to flee just a few days before Hitler took power, and which would have led to his own inevitable arrest if he'd stayed. And he found refuge in New York during the war period. Then this work itself, which is so painful to look at, and this references the murder of his friend, who was a Jewish writer and communist, Erich Mussbaum, who died in a concentration camp. And Gross depicts this scene with sort of characteristic savagery. We have this casually brutal attitude of the torturers, the free-flowing blood, really horrific. But the drawing, there are drawings on this theme as well, so it's part of a body of work which uses Mussbaum in all these pictures. And he's seen really not as an individual, although his individual fate, of course, was terrible, but as a symbol for representing the fate of all the victims of the Nazi regime. And the work also artistically bears comparison with Piero della Francesca and the Flagellation of Christ. But interestingly about Gross's own story, although he remained in New York until 1946, he became disillusioned with the American dream, and he would return to Berlin later, where he died shortly afterwards.
Well, you might understand why Gross maybe returned to his cultural roots after the war, but we know that some Jews also returned to Germany and Austria, where I suppose the food and the life and the language and customs were more familiar to them than in the places where they'd emigrated to. in spite of the decimation of Jewish cultural life in those countries and sustained anti-Semitism, which carried on. I wondered if this raised the questions about the relationship between religion and culture for secular Jews.
Yeah, I think that's a really important and sort of wide question, which we can just perhaps touch on today. And this work by Mark Chagall is perhaps a good example of that. So he was born, as is commonly known, in Vitebsk in Russia, now Belarus, but had pursued artistic freedom in France, was known as a modernist in painting, and became a French citizen in 1937. However, his work always drew on his upbringing. He was born into a Jewish Hasidic family who were religiously observant, of course, and he also was concerned to record things about everyday Jewish life. We see some of the familiar tropes of his painting in this one, in the figures who appear to float on the right, but it's actually a much more traumatic picture than a lot of those earlier, more celebratory pieces. He did a number of crucifixions, of course, but this one is very bleak, and it was done while he himself was in exile, again in New York during the Second World War. He was forced to flee there with his wife Bella from France after the German occupation of France and their uncertain status in Vichy France. And they eventually got to the US on forged visas. However, Bella died suddenly and unexpectedly in 1944, and Chagall actually stopped painting for a time. But in 1945, with the end of the war and then the breaking of the news of the concentration camps through the Pathé newsreels that were shown in the cinemas, he felt compelled to pick up his tools again and to make an artistic response. And we see here a Jewish Christ being crucified. He's identifiable by these Jewish phylacteries, the prayer shawl. And yet, interestingly, he's also a hermaphrodite figure. And it's thought that he was trying really to commemorate, to symbolize both the male and the female victims of the Holocaust. Perhaps there's also a reference there to Bella's death. And the scenes below include all these various little vignettes, all horrific scenes in concentration camps, hangings, burnings, and so on. And even a little boatload of refugees in the upper right middle section of the picture.
Mm. Are you suggesting that Chagall was in this sense a refugee himself?
He could be described as a refugee in this period. Of course, he'd gone to France originally for artistic freedoms and chosen to remain there. And of course, he would return to France eventually after the war in, I think, 1948, and remained in France, where he died for the rest of his life. But certainly his period in New York, he was seeking refuge, and normally we refer to him as being in exile there. But, you know, certainly I think that that label is not amiss for this period of his life. A very different work from the Chagall that I thought I would include is this work by Hans Feibusch, showing Jacob wrestling with the angel. So this is a work by an assimilated German Jewish artist, so very different to Chagall, who, as we touched on, had this very strongly Jewish background, including a very religious background, and referred to that always in his work. Feibusch had begun a successful career as a painter in his native Germany, but after early success, he suffered cultural persecution by the Nazis and found refuge in Britain in 1933. And he found success in painting mainly murals for the Church of England. He was championed by Bishop Bell of Chichester, and he went on to create some 35 Church of England commissions for churches all over the country. However, the work on screen is slightly more unusual in that it was commissioned by Rabbi Hugo Gryn, who was himself a Holocaust survivor. He was then senior rabbi at the West London Synagogue in 1973, and he knew Freibusch, and he commissioned this series of 5 paintings. This is one of the 5. They're all monumental in size, sort of about 12, 14 feet in height, something like that. And in 2012, the synagogue could no longer house the paintings, and so Ben Uri purchased them in order to preserve them. And really, we've been searching for suitable setting ever since. And they have just gone on long-term loan to St. Bonifatius Church in London, which is the German-speaking Roman Catholic church in the heart of the East End, once the home, of course, of the London's Jewish quarter, now housing many mosques, of course. And so there's a very circular sort of story in the painting's history, but also perhaps with Freibusch himself, because although he was born a Jew, he converted to Anglicanism after the death of his wife in the 60s. But then at the end of his life, he reverted back to Judaism and had a Jewish burial. So the work itself, the Jacob wrestling with the angel, that's a kind of theme of faith, of struggle, of redemption. And I think it's one that also applies to his own personal history. A contrast to that is this work by Kurt Schwitters, known chiefly as the Dardist and as the father of Merz, this bringing together of scraps of detritus, of rubbish, and this collage technique. And he was not Jewish, of course, and was a cultural refugee, disapproved of as a degenerate artist by the Nazis. And he fled to Norway initially in 1937, and then had to leave there and came to Britain, where in fact he was interned with his son on the Isle of Man, and remained in Britain after that experience until his death.
Well, what criteria were used to determine who was interred in the Isle of Man during the war? Who was put there? How did they decide?
Yeah, well, there were around about 74,000 former German and Austrian citizens who were resident in Britain at the outbreak of the Second World War. Many of them, as we've seen, having arrived as refugees from Nazi persecution, and they were all registered as so-called enemy aliens and organised by regional tribunals. And then in June 1940, Prime Minister Churchill, with sort of things beginning to increase on the war front, was asked what should happen to all these people, and he issued a directive famously to collar the lot. So they were all rounded up, and around 27,000 of them were put into camps, initially transit camps on the mainland, and then internment camps. In Britain, they were places like the Isle of Man, where Schwitters was, but they were also sent to other parts of the Commonwealth, like Canada and indeed Australia. And, in the camps were mixed together, therefore, people who'd fled persecution, people who might be pro-Nazi, people from all walks of life. In fact, the refugees themselves who were there were so organised that they managed to set up so-called university camps. They had lectures on the lawn. They had people from every walk of life, but in the collection, of course, we have work that represents that artist contingent, and I think we have about 16 or 18 artists in the collection who actually were interned at that time.
Just looking at these images, what was the relationship between Schwitters and Frankl, these two artists?
Yeah, they had known each other in Frankfurt. They'd been part of the same kind of artistic circles and had a friendship. And after Schwitters made this work in 1927, he dedicated it for Frau Frankl in 1928. And we've just heard how he came over to Britain as a refugee. And Elsa Frankl made a similar journey and settled in St John's Wood during the war, near to Ben Uri, as it is now. It wasn't there then. And she actually brought this work with her, so it was obviously very important to her. And the two artists would be reunited and would actually rekindle their friendship while here in Britain. So it seemed to me important to honour both their journeys and that important artistic and indeed personal friendship between them. I also wanted to look at this work by Frank Calbach as another example of someone who came as a refugee. Frank Calbach was only 8 when he was sent to this country. He too came from a German Jewish assimilated background, and he was sent on to Britain by his parents. He came on a ship, not the Kindertransport, although it's often thought that he did a similar rescue mission organised by the writer Iris Arrigo. And his parents, who remained behind, subsequently perished in concentration camps. And he was sent firstly to Bunce Court, which was a progressive boarding school in Kent for Jewish refugee children, and then went on, of course, famously to attend St Martin's, David Bomberg's evening classes and the Royal College of Art, and to his illustrious career. And this landscape is one of a number depicting the Mornington Crescent area where he's lived and worked in a studio for more than 60 years, and which interestingly was vacated by his friend Leon Kossoff, and it was passed on to him by another Polish Jewish immigrant refugee artist, Gustav Metzger, just about to open tonight in an exhibition at Ben Uri, and who did come over as a child on the Kindertransport himself.
It seems a little atypical of the Auerbachs that I'm familiar with, which are a lot darker. But I was wondering what you think influenced Auerbach's characteristic technique of the use of thick and heavily worked paint. You know, this question just comes from my interest in making paintings.
Yeah, well, it'd be lovely actually to hear what you think about it. But you know, this heavy sort of impasto is really characteristic of his work, but it does change from those very early works of things like the London building sites and so forth, and some of the portraits he did in the 50s, 60s and so on, where we know that he was going back to the studio, scraping off all the paint and starting again, and it was really built up in layers. But this seems much more quickly done. There is that build-up of paint in certain areas, but not in that same way. It just looks as though it's much more quickly applied, and it captures, for me, that kind of urgency and transience of this bustling London scene and this kind of vigorous surge of pigment throughout the painting. But I'd love to hear what you think, Aviva.
Well, it's certainly, I mean, it looks like it's really retained its bright colours. So I mean, I would never hazard a guess at how this picture's made without actually seeing it, you know, physically. But judging by the photograph, you know, it looks like it's been applied, as you say, quite directly. So there's wet and wet, application of paint, and you can see the sort of blending of green and yellow stripes. You can see probably the use of palette knife. I'm probably making a lot of mistakes here about how it's made. It doesn't look quite as thick as some of the others that I've seen or is built up, but you can also see that even the date it's been incised into wet paint, quite thick wet paint. You know, they're 2004, so fairly late. But this definitely has retained its bright color. It hasn't darkened, and it doesn't contain some of the sort of earthy pigments that, or iron-containing pigments that seem to darken in oil media. And some of them are incredibly heavy, some of the paintings, you know, to actually physically heavy with oil paint. And you can smell the oil paint, which is amazing. It hasn't properly dried or cross-linked. You know, it seems to me that, I mean, Auerbach's oeuvre is largely inspired by the London cityscape and also portraits of family and friends, and what he saw rather than what he imagined. And in his work, there aren't obvious references to culture, his cultural or even religious identity. And that really contrasts with Chagall's images. Do you think that reflects Chagall's experience of working in occupied France, where perhaps collaboration with the Nazis put the Jews in danger, direct danger, versus Auerbach's working in Britain, who clearly resisted the genocide? Or maybe it's a more individual response, with Auerbach living in the here and now and not in the past. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's certainly true what you say about this fundamental difference between their subject matter and approach. But I also think that as an immigrant and indeed a refugee, Auerbach has a particular concern in focusing on a home area. So I mentioned how long he'd been in this studio, and you know, he spends the majority of his time really rooted there in that studio, and his work seems to me to have this particular focus on this home location and what you might call a family of familiar sitters. He often paints just people who are very well known to him, who sit over very long periods of time, and that actually includes his family, his wife Julia, his son Jake. And I think there's certainly an exploration of issues around refuge, identity, migration, although it's more oblique, certainly is rooted, as you say, in what he is seeing, what's actually around him. But I was kind of looking at things he might have said about his experience, and I was interested in this quote where he says, "I wasn't British born, I didn't have a family, and I didn't have anything to anchor me to whatever was going on," end quote. So for me, this picture does anchor him to familiar surroundings, and that's perhaps deliberate. We do see him using familiar architectural structures, and there's a definite sense of place in his pictures. He sort of deliberately restricts his language, his landscape motifs, and concentrates on locating himself in this particular London locale, and always foregrounding this area around his studio home with these distinctive features like the landmark chimney there in the painting. I guess part of that, but very different again, is this work by Leon Kossoff. So Kossoff, of course, had a similar artistic background, a similar training to Auerbach. The two men were friends and worked together very often. But Kossoff was born in Islington, but to first generation Russian Jewish immigrant parents, and he was raised in the East End where they had a bakery. So he was in the heart again of the Jewish community at that time. But obviously he then went on to embrace this career as a British artist.
So he was British born. Do you think that Kossoff's work was influenced by his parents' cultural background or his British experience?
I think inevitably there was something of both. You know, it was important that he had these immigrant and Jewish roots. And we know also that he also very strongly located himself in the area. So he recalled, for example, passing every day the Spitalfields Church, and that became a really dominant motif in his paintings and etchings. Indeed, in the print that we have, the church is a sort of towering presence, and it really gives you that perspective of him passing it every day as a child, and it's that kind of child's eye view. But he also talked about the urgency of being impelled to work by an accumulation of memories, and the idea that time was short and one had to capture things within this period. But from those kind of landscape motifs, looking at the picture that's on the screen, this portrait, interestingly, this is one of 3 portraits he did of an emigre called Sonia Hussein, who may have been a distant relative. And she's known here by her nom de plume, which was NM Sido. And she was an important model in this period for Kossoff. And she writes about their relationship in her autobiography. And that also movingly describes her own experiences as a refugee, because she had to flee pogroms, fear, loss, etc. in her native Romania. So this portrait by Kossoff is many things, but one of the things it does for me is to clearly capture that kind of suffering and to give her a kind of strong rooted presence through the way that he depicts her with these heavy dark outlines filling the picture space. I wanted to just include also a few of the works by some of the contemporary artists that we talked about at the beginning. And this one in particular is by an artist called Gula Ateş. And Gula was born in Eastern Turkey, and she comes from a Zaza ethnicity. So her first language is Zazaka, which was forbidden to be spoken in Turkish schools, and in fact is now listed as an endangered language by UNESCO. And she immigrated to Britain around 1999, graduated from the Royal College of Art, and is now a digital print tutor at the Royal Academy schools. And she makes this multidisciplinary work. This is a photograph of a performance. And the performance was set in Lapa Rio, sort of bohemian cultural neighborhood. And this veiled figure that you see in the foreground on the right-hand side is really a common motif in her work. And she shows this figure crossing the picture and pulling a house behind her. And she had this very interesting way of expanding on her work and how she explores these concepts of displacement. And she uses the phrase that we carry our mental home, quotes, mental home wherever we go.
Can you explain in more detail what you mean by mental home here?
Yeah, I guess it's something which encompasses all of the things that we've looked at with the different artists in the last few pictures. So whether this is an accumulation of memories, such as Kossoff mentions, whether it is rooting yourself somewhere because of dislocation, whether it's a specific refugee journey like Hermann's Warsaw, or indeed, again, a kind of rooting common to work by someone like Gertler, set in the Jewish East End. So for me, a mental home would be to bring with you as a refugee or a migrant something that's been left behind, whether that's your culture, your language, your experience, your faith, or a desire to root yourself somewhere or to make a new identity. And these figures as artists have often been able to really push and explore all these concepts. And I emailed with Gula in advance of this event, sort of thinking about her own experience. And she describes herself as an immigrant, very happy to be an immigrant. And she likes the word migration. She said she likes how birds and animals move to a new space in order that they can carry on living. And that seemed to me a really good connection to another work by a contemporary artist in the collection. This is by Zory Sharoki, and she's a British-Iranian artist based in Greater London, and her work also explores issues around displacement and the human condition.
Can you tell us a bit about Zory's background, especially in relation to this image?
Yes, so the image we see is called Swallow, and it's from the installation that you see on the right called Flying. And each of these swallows is made from Persian cloth. And this is cloth that was sent to Zory by her family and friends since she left her native Iran. She grew up in Iran, of course, and her work is strongly influenced by things like Persian poetry and rug design, and fabrics and so on. But it also relates to her own experience in the sense that after the 1979 revolution, she lost almost all the people who were close to her, and she became an immigrant to this country where she describes her work and what she does as experiencing the dehumanization of refugees and the ongoing struggle to be part of this society naturally is part of my work. So it seemed to me that these swallows, migratory birds, really encapsulated everything about that journey. From Zory, I wanted to share this image, which is actually a still photograph from a film made by the artist Edwin Mingard, who was born in England but has immigrant descendants. And he was actually commissioned by Ben Uri to respond to our centenary exhibition Out of Chaos at Somerset House next to the Courtauld back in 2015. And he tells here the story, an imagined story, but based on interviews he did with contemporary migrants and refugees, of a recent Muslim arrival to Britain, to London from Egypt, called Yusuf, who's trying to make his way in the big city, working in a restaurant, poor living conditions, overworked, lack of human rights, and so forth. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to see the whole film, so this is just a snapshot from it.
Okay, can you explain the importance of this work in the Ben Uri collection itself? Yeah,
so it's important as telling this contemporary story, which is really, really important and still very underrepresented in museums today. I'm sure that's changing, and lots of artists, of course, are making work on this subject. But also he specifically tied it into the Ben Uri collection because he also set up certain shots and scenes in the film, and indeed costumes, to respond to artworks from the Ben Uri collection, including the Gertler Rabbi and Rebbitzin that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. But I just wanted to end with this work by Leslie Morgan, who's an artist and an academic. He was born in England and described himself as of Anglo-Indian parentage. And he originally exhibited in England in the 1980s in early shows of black art in Brixton, before moving to Australia, where he did a PhD on the significance of diaspora politics in the visual arts. And I think this work brings together those concerns. I also included it because I've only recently learned more about it from the one of the grandchildren of the couple pictured at the front of the painting. I knew a little bit about it from Les, but I didn't realise it was based on a specific couple. And it's part of a series of paintings called Anglo-Indian Sail into White Australia. And it records this moment in August 1947, when Australia operated a white Australia policy, which was designed to limit, to prevent immigration by non-white, non-European nationals. But what happened at this period was with the partition of India, a number of Anglo-Indians, about 700, were on board a ship called the Manura, which was coming into dock in, I think it was Adelaide. And on board also were 20 Polish refugees. So the minister at the time was faced with a decision as to whether to implement this White Australia policy, and in order to sort of avoid, I guess, an incident, he allowed the ship to dock and everybody disembarked. Yeah. And not only do we tackle that kind of issue by looking at this painting, but the couple can be identified actually as Mr. and Mrs. Hurft, who had previously a very comfortable lifestyle in India and were forced to flee at a moment's notice with almost nothing. So they were genuine refugees to Australia. They were initially housed in a migration hostel assisted by the National Council of Women. But while they received some help like that, they also, of course, faced lots of difficulties and prejudice like the other refugees and migrants we've looked at. And Les's work is really interesting in that he combines this sort of painting and collage technique. As he says, there's a kind of ambiguity as to what you can see and what overlaps. And perhaps that's a good place for me to end.
It's amazing. It's amazing to see this painting painted so recently, a reminiscence of somebody's family history and the treatment they received. It reminds me, when I grew up in Melbourne in the 60s, you know, that overhang from that policy, there were lots of immigrants. They were mainly from Greece and Italy, and they used to live in these corrugated iron kind of sheds. It's really hot in the summer in Melbourne, cold in winter. And I remember thinking, wow, you know, that's I also remember, and I must have been old enough to have seen a black person for the first time. I was old enough to think that's a black person. So even in the 60s, I'm ashamed to say. So thank you, Sarah. That's an amazing introduction to the collection. It really was. It's really interesting, fascinating. There's a lot more to talk about and to say. I'm really looking forward to our project, which we are working on now on Francesca Temerson, who's born in Poland but working in Britain, not as a refugee or an exile, but working in Britain as a painter in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. And we're working on that now, which is an interesting project. But I think we've actually come to the end of our time, and there may be questions, so I should hand back to Leila to field those.
Yes, thank you both so much. I feel like I've learned many, many things in such a small amount of time there. We have probably about 5 minutes now for one or two audience questions. And the first one is asking if or does Ben Uri work with immigrant and refugee communities, and whether it uses the collection as, you know, a kind of springboard for community collaboration and conversation.
We have certainly done so on a number of occasions. We have worked with, mainly through our education department, we've worked with different communities, looking at things like the Notting Hill Carnival. We've shown work which was by contemporary refugee artists responding to other artists in the collection. There have been 2 exhibitions around that. One from 2016 was called Unexpected. We don't generally commission artists as such. The Edwin Mingard film was an exception because we were given an HLF grant to enable that experience around the centenary show. But we also had an exhibition which was called £36.95, which is what refugees and migrants had to live on. That's the allowance they were given. So there have been a number of projects around that, and we've also engaged when we did the Unexpected exhibition. The contemporary artists came predominantly from working with Counterpoints Arts, who absolutely specialise in this area, and they do fantastic work. So our remit kind of covers a number of things which include working with artists from those communities when opportunities arise, but it's not something that we do necessarily on a kind of daily, regular basis. But the collection and the research work that we do is designed to reflect their contribution to British visual arts.
Amazing, thank you. And I guess it's difficult at the moment to think about things we used to do and what we can do coming out of the pandemic and the easing of restrictions. There's going to be so many more opportunities to be creative in a live sense. So we have one more question, which I think we can probably ask before we round up. And it's from Janet, and she's asking, do you find the current language of hostile environment and government policy relating to immigration has changed / influenced how you work in the gallery? Has it made you more cautious of your work? Or is it
I don't think so. I think we just became very conscious when we moved our collection, and we looked again at it around 2010, and already in the early 2000s we had looked and changed our policy to reflect contemporary experience more widely and to include non-Jewish as well as Jewish artists. I would say the only thing is that I am very conscious of when we set up BURU, which is our research unit, Ben Uri research unit, and that looks at this Jewish and immigrant contribution. And we had to think very much about how to describe that tin, what you say on the tin kind of thing. And we very specifically decided to use the words immigrant and not émigré or exile. So these terms are also very commonly used, and there is exile studies and exile art and émigré artists, and all of these things could be applied. But émigré also has some specific context which suggests one type of background and a bringing of something with you, which may be material as well as cultural or memories, or those things we've talked about. But the fact that the term immigrant is used often in the press as almost a term of abuse, I think that's something we wanted to very much positivize. It's just a verb, and as we hear from people like Gula, she's very happy to be an immigrant, and we're very happy to, celebrate the richness of the immigrant contribution. So I think that language was sort of in place, and I don't believe we were influenced by things that happen in government and newspapers and so on, because that's so transient and ongoing, and so many debates kind of bubble up very quickly now with the advent of social media and so forth. So I think one has to be certainly aware of all those things, but kind of stick to your own remit and not be too over-influenced by what's happening in that sense.
Definitely, thank you. And just before we round up, I wondered if you wanted to quickly let everyone know how to access the collection, as I realise we've not said that yet, and what you have on at the moment.
How absolutely remiss of me. Yeah. Yes, please do go to our main website, www.benuri.org. You'll find there the collection, exhibitions, and many more things. And I hope that people might like to join us this evening. We have a Zoom private view. Who knew there were such things a while ago? For our Gustav Metzger exhibition, which explores the early years of this artist and activist. So the private view is tonight from 6:30 to 7, and then we will actually be open in the real world for people to visit the gallery. We do ask for bookings and observing social guidelines for COVID, but it opens to the public tomorrow. So please do visit both the website and the gallery if you can.
Great, well, thank you both so much, and I will definitely book my ticket in to come visit sometime soon. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure we could talk for the rest of the day. But yeah, thank you for everyone joining us at home, and enjoy the rest of your day and hopefully get out in the sunshine. Bye for now, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.